Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, Chapter 9, Flood. Chapter 9 is really a transition chapter between the via positiva and via negativa portions of this book. It is, as some of her other chapters, simply an exploration of a moment. She's talking about the intense flood from leftover Hurricane Agnes. And in this chapter, she describes the damage of the flood, as well as the way people responded to it. And for the most part, she doesn't explain to us how we ought to respond. She merely records what happens and how people react. In some ways, it's like the cat paw prints at the beginning of the book. It feels as though it ought to have meaning, but she doesn't give it to us. The chapter is filled with a lot of pessimism and dark imagery. Things dying and being swept away, as well as a general sense of destruction and loss. But there's also the idea of the unexpected and the surprise. On page 154, she says, "I expect to see anything at all. In this one way, the creek is more like itself when it floods than at any other time, mediating, bringing things down. As the flood is washing through and destroying homes and environments, it's carrying the detritus of all of its destruction along with it. And all the surprising things she sees washing through the floodwaters stand out as a kind of symbol of how the creek continues to surprise. And yet the surprises are generally not of a positive nature. But one significant surprise she mentions at the end of the chapter is a giant mushroom, which she hears that the Bings have found after the flood, and she imagines it grows out of their flooded home. This is a pleasant surprise because it's an edible mushroom. But she also discovers that this story is not true. She says, "I like to think that the flood left them a gift, a consolation prize, so that for years to come they would be finding edible mushrooms here and there about the house, dinner on the bookshelf, hors d'oeuvres in the piano. It would have been nice." But in spite of the somewhat positive feeling created by a consolation prize, we realize that there is no consolation prize in this flood. At least not in this chapter. Instead, it's a general washing away of everything you generally hold on to. It is one of the most humanly populated chapters in her book. Everyone gets together in response to the flood. And a lot of times we think of disasters as opportunity for unifying and drawing people together. And yet, generally in this chapter, the people who are drawn together mostly just stand around helplessly looking at the destruction. There's not a lot they can do as the waters rise up to 12 feet above their normal levels, washing over bridges and washing out homes. It's as though most of the positive things that could come from this disaster are washed out from under them in the waters of the flood, along with all of her old ideas, which is going to lead her to new ideas. Finally, I want to note that this chapter begins and ends with a kind of mushroom. There's a strange growth that she sees at the beginning of the chapter on her walk that she cannot identify. It's an amorphous blob of fungus. And as I mentioned before, the chapter ends with the edible mushroom that the Bings find. But although it seems to begin with an unidentifiable mushroom and end with one that's more positive, even the positive one is undermined, as I said before, by the fact that the story is not true. All in all, this chapter reminds us that surprise occurs, disasters occurs, ideas can change, and leaves us uncertain of anything we've heard so far. In general, it's preparing us for the uncertainty that's going to take her as we begin chapter 10. And she begins to rethink her way of looking at the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.